The first thing your lawyer says to you is, if you don't take this deal, the prosecutor will push this to trial, and if you lose, you could get 30 years. No warning, no soft voice, no reassurance, just that. You sit there in county jail clothes, the red marks from the cuffs still pressed into your wrists, while he slides a single sheet of paper across the table like it weighs nothing. You look down, plead guilty, time served plus probation, and that is the moment. Everything inside you begins to split apart, because the most terrifying thing is not being forced to confess when you're guilty. The most terrifying thing is being innocent, knowing you're innocent, and still having to seriously consider signing your name to a lie. You were arrested for a robbery gone wrong. The kind of case people hear about on the news and decide they already understand before the facts are even finished being spoken. Only you didn't do it. That turns out not to matter as much as you always believed it would. The system does not need absolute certainty, it just needs enough. One witness who isn't fully sure but sounds sure enough on paper. One cop willing to say you match the description. One prosecutor who knows how to turn fragments into a story. And one exhausted, broke, terrified defendant sitting under fluorescent lights with a plea deal in front of him. You grew up thinking justice was where the truth got uncovered. But in this room, truth feels almost irrelevant. What they need is not the truth. They just need somebody willing to carry it. The arrest happened fast enough that your brain never caught up with your body. Hands on you. Orders barked like you were already convicted. The cold metal snap of cuffs. You kept saying there had to be some mistake, that they had the wrong person, that you didn't know what they were talking about. One of them told you, save it for court, with the bored confidence of a man who had said it 100 times before. At the station, they sat you in a room and began attaching you to a life you had never lived. Bit by bit, piece by piece, you had been near the area. Somebody said they saw someone who looked like you. Your phone had gone dark for a stretch of time. You had a minor record before, been stopped before, been unlucky before, been in the wrong place at the wrong time often enough that now it could be rearranged into something uglier. Every piece alone felt weak, embarrassingly weak, but once they stacked them together, they stopped looking like fragments and started looking like a case. You still believed in those first hours that if you just told the truth clearly enough, calmly enough, long enough, somebody would hear it and this would all unwind. That was the first illusion to die. When the court-appointed lawyer finally came to see you, he did not begin with innocence or guilt. He began with numbers. What percentage of cases like this end in pleas? How many defendants lose at trial? What the sentencing range looks like if the prosecutor gets everything he wants? How charge stacking works? How they can pile allegation on top of allegation until the possible sentence becomes less like law and more like a weapon. He talked the way an accountant might talk about risk. Quietly, clinically, almost kindly. And that was somehow worse. This was when you learned the legal system does not move like a movie. It moves like the math of desperation. If we win, he told you, you go home. You held on to that part for half a second. If we lose, you could lose 25 to 30 years. The air in the room changed. And if you take the plea, you get out a lot sooner. You stared at him and said the only thing that still seemed real. But I didn't do it. He looked at you for a long time before answering. I know, but that's not the only question here. And for the first time in your life, you understood that innocent and safe are not always the same thing. To fight the case, you would need time, money, investigators, witnesses people could actually find, experts who could challenge whatever story the state planned to tell. You had none of it. You were sitting in jail waiting for trial because the bail was higher than anything your family could touch. While the case crawled forward, your life outside began collapsing in real time. Work stopped calling, rent went late, then later, then impossible. The person who loved you most started sounding scared every time they got on the phone. Your family tried to scrape money together, but every favor had a ceiling, every loan had a bottom. And everybody was already drowning in their own lives. You could feel things falling away from you one by one, not because you had been sentenced, but because you were waiting to be sentenced. That is the part people on the outside never understand. Innocent people do not plead guilty because they are weak. They plead guilty because the system makes holding on to the truth so expensive that, eventually, it starts to look like a luxury item only the rich can afford. Then your lawyer came back with the official offer. If you pleaded guilty, the prosecutor would drop the heavier charges, reduce the exposure, cut the risk down to something survivable, maybe probation, maybe time served, maybe a short sentence instead of a life-breaking one. If you refused, they would go forward with everything, every charge, every ugly inference, every witness statement twisted into certainty, or every gap in your life repackaged as motive. You read the paperwork again and again until the words stopped looking like language and started looking like a death certificate for the person you had been before this happened. Because buried inside all that legal language was the one demand that made your hands go cold. You had to admit in open court that you did something you knew you did not do. Nobody was holding a gun to your head. That was the genius of it. No visible violence, no screaming, no force you could point to later. Just statistics, fear, time, and a system patient enough to let those things do the strangling for it. You held the pen for a long time, long enough for it to become unbearable, long enough for your hand to feel detached from the rest of you, like it belonged to somebody else. Every second stretched into a private war. Keep the truth. Or keep what's left of your future. You thought about your mother, about your child, about the person waiting for you to come home before all of this turned them into somebody tired and frightened. You thought about the bills, the apartment, your health, your age. You thought about 30 years in a cell and what that would do to your face, your back, your mind, your name, and in the end, you signed. Not because you suddenly believed you were guilty, not because justice had convinced you, but because the system had turned the words, "I am innocent," into a bet so expensive you could no longer afford to place it. In that moment, you did not sign a confession. You signed an acknowledgement that your truth was not strong enough to keep the rest of your life alive. You got out much sooner than the maximum sentence hanging over your head. Technically, people called you lucky. At least you're out now. It could have been worse. Just move on. They said it like freedom and release were the same thing. But once you stepped back into the world, you realized you had not been freed. You had only been transferred into a different kind of cage. You had a conviction now, a record. Every application asked the same poisoned question. Every landlord saw risk where you saw survival. Jobs dried up before they began. Doors closed politely, then permanently. People looked at you like a guilty man who had gotten off easy. And only you knew the truth. You were an innocent man who had signed his own captivity because it was the only version of survival the system offered. The real sentence was not in the court file. It lived in other people's faces. Friends disappeared in quiet ways that hurt more than open betrayal. Some family members stood by you, others asked the question that cut deeper every time. If you were innocent, and why did you plead guilty? There is no short answer to that question, not one that can carry the weight of that room, that paper, that threat, that math. Not one that can make someone feel 30 years, pressing down on your chest while your whole life outside is bleeding out by the week. You sat in job interviews and watched the exact moment a hiring manager's expression changed. You saw your own name become a warning label. You learned that a plea deal is not really an escape hatch at all. It is the mechanism by which the state turns a case it might not win into a stain it can make permanent. The prison term may be shorter, the social sentence has no release date. Time moved forward because it always does, but your life did not move cleanly with it. You took whatever work you could get. Temporary jobs, quiet jobs, jobs that asked fewer questions because they expected less from you. You moved, then moved again. Relationships frayed under the pressure of money, shame, and the constant low-grade panic that never really left your nervous system. Some nights you couldn't sleep. Some days you were angry before anyone even spoke to you. Maybe you drank too much. Maybe you withdrew. Maybe you became somebody harder, flatter, less recognizable even to yourself. And the cruelest part was that your suffering did not look dramatic enough for the world to call it tragic. On paper, you had admitted guilt. On paper, the system had worked. On paper, you were not a victim. So you lived inside a private paradox. In order to escape being crushed by the machine, you had handed it the one piece of evidence it would use to follow you forever. What you mourned was not just the truth. It was the version of yourself that existed before you ever picked up that pen. Then, years later, the thing you had stopped expecting finally arrived. New evidence. Maybe it was DNA. Maybe a camera angle nobody found the first time. Maybe the real offender confessed. Maybe a witness took it back. Or maybe old forensic work fell apart under scrutiny. Maybe somebody in that original case got investigated, and suddenly the whole story began to rot from the inside. A lawyer called, or an innocence organization? Somebody told you there was a path now, a real one, to proving what you had been saying from the beginning. It should have felt like salvation. Instead, it felt like grief reopening with sharper teeth, because by the time the truth came back for you, your life had already been bent around its absence. Careers were gone. Years were gone. Love was gone. The world had already decided what kind of person you were, and the world is rarely eager to correct itself just because the facts finally caught up. The truth did arrive. It just arrived after your life had already learned how to survive without it. Eventually, the conviction was undone. The plea was withdrawn. Your name was cleared. On paper, you were clean again. But real life does not reset because a court finally fixes one line in a file. Nobody hands back the lost years. Nobody restores the first chance that vanished when your record did. Nobody repairs the relationships that cracked under suspicion and stayed broken under silence. The story of your exoneration does not travel half as far as the story of your arrest. People remember the first headline. They do not remember the correction. Legally, you won. But the life you were supposed to be living had been losing for years by then. And maybe that is why the memory that stays with you is not the arrest, not the jail, not even the day your name was finally cleared. It is that room, that table, that sheet of paper, that pen in your hand. You still understand why you signed. That may be the worst part of all. You are not even certain that if time folded in on itself and gave you another chance, you would have had the strength to choose differently. Because the deepest cruelty was never just the lie you were made to say. It was the design of the room itself, the way it cornered an innocent person until the truth began to feel like something only the reckless could afford. People like to believe justice fails when an innocent person is convicted, but sometimes justice fails much earlier than that. Sometimes it fails in the exact moment an innocent person stares at the possibility of 30 years behind bars, then signs a false confession with his own hand just to preserve whatever scraps of life he still has left to save.